And, the treaty demands that First Nations, quote, do hereby cede, release, surrender, and yield up to the government of the Dominion of Canada for Her Majesty the Queen and her successors forever all their rights, titles, and privileges whatsoever to the lands, end quote. And I just can't see the chiefs agreeing to that, certainly to that letter of the law. And neither can Nokum Joanne Saddleback nor Musum Jerry Saddleback, traditional knowledge keepers from Treaty 6 in Alberta.
That in Cree, we don't have words like ceded or surrender or submit or anything like that. Those words don't exist because our concepts of thinking, our philosophies, they don't work in that sense.
We didn't cede it, nor did we surrender it, nor did we relinquish that land, because that's our mum. The way they interpreted it, we may as well just have said, okay, here, take our mum then, go ahead, have at her, do whatever you want with our mother. We may as well have said that.
But what it meant to them clearly differed from what it meant to the settlers. Here's Sheldon again.
The Crown had a strategic plan to mislead First Nations over the surrender clause. They knew First Nations would not agree to surrender their land, and so they did not ask it. They did not mention it during the treaty. And the fact that they snuck it in the treaty text makes it a not very important document to me.
That Sheldon says the treaty text itself is not important, that's a bit shocking.
So what was the Cree understanding of the agreement then?
So the Crees were agreeing to what was spoken, what was said. And, it wasn't about giving up the land. But some of the First Nations leadership present could sort of see the writing on the wall. Chief Poundmaker, a Plains Cree leader, spoke out when reserve land was offered, saying,
"This is our land. It isn't a piece of pemmican to be cut off and given in little pieces back to us."
In response to Poundmaker's skepticism, a couple of the other more, shall I say, settler-friendly leaders, Mistawasis and Atakakup, essentially overruled him, asking him, quote, "Have you anything better to offer our people?" And Poundmaker didn't.
So some of the leaders were okay with the deal then?
Yeah, it seems like a good majority of folks on both sides were eager to get into agreement, or at least what they thought they were agreeing to. Again, times were hard. The bison was disappearing, people were starving. Signing the treaty was at least supposed to come with some support. And I think what's most important here, or perhaps more important anyway, is who signed those X's. So it was the men. I sort of viewed that as these were the leaders of the community. Of course, the men would be the ones that were reflected in the history books. They're the ones whose words are recorded during negotiations. They were the ones who signed the documents. But according to Cree oral history and tradition, the men actually couldn't sign the land over.
People have often asked me where were the women during this time, and I always tell them in the center. We were in the center. It was women who created and looked over the decision-making processes.
Nokum Joanne Saddleback says, while the women are hardly reflected in the Western versions of how Treaty 6 was signed, they were very much present and important in Cree communities, which were often matriarchal societies. Dr. James McCocus agrees.
In our nations as Nehiyawak people, women own the land, women are landowners, women bring forth the next generation, and women have a say over the land. Women did not agree to the treaty. They did not put their hand on the treaty. And so in our worldview, it was never about ceasing or surrendering our lands. It was about sharing it.
Now, generally, Plains Cree societies were sort of meritocracies. Everybody had a say. The women would lead conversations about land and water. The men would handle peace treaties and conflicts. This is why it's generally thought that the First Nations never intended to surrender, cede, or yield land on Treaty 6. The men signed it because it was about peace and friendship, not the land.
So basically what's implied here is that if the treaty signing had anything to do with the land, the women would have been there, the women would have been in charge.
And the women would have signed the document.
Right.
Okay. And I'm sure that these men coming over, these crown officials and government representatives, are used to dealing with men. So the idea of them having to sit down and talk to women was probably terrifying for them.
I think what's important here, again, to differentiate is that it wasn't as if the women were not involved. You know, they had a say in these conversations as well. But they were under the impression that this was a treaty that was meant to establish peace and friendship and to avoid conflict, which would have been the men's domain.
Right. So they were agreeing to share the land in exchange for some cash, ammunition, and farming supplies.